video we'll have a think about international agreements and environmentalism. So I think at this point it is important to recognise how far the environmental movement has come from the 1950s. So if you remember back in the 1950s, it was an emerging but still a very peripheral part of society, and environmentalists were often regarded with suspicion by large sectors of society. Now we're moving into a situation in the 2020s when environmental movements are very much political mainstream. And we're going to go on to have a think about, even though they are politically mainstream and politically accepted, with members of parliament and members of government from environmental parties like the Green Party, actually getting a role in government. But we're going on to think how actually effective is this newfound political respectability. So the first one, international agreement, we're going to look here is the Stockholm Declaration. On the website, I'll let you have a look at what those 26 principles there that cover in the Stockholm Declaration. As with most of these international agreements, they are statements of principle, but they're actually very difficult to measure. There is nothing here that is quantifiable. So one of the big things here when looking at this list is number 23, each nation must establish its own standards. So just that sort of clause tells us straight away that there's no actual standards there. It's for each country to establish their own standards. So you'd really have to ask the question, what is the point in these actual agreements? It's not something that is enshrined in law. These are voluntary agreements. There's nothing here that is actually quantifiable, and particularly number 3, each nation must establish its own standards. They can be as high or as low as you can possibly want. And then we go on to have a look at Agenda 21. Again, the same sort of concerns about these international agreements. They're not binding, they are just agreements, and a lot of the detail of the policies here, again, are very, very open to interpretation. Another thing that we're starting to see increasingly with these international agreements is the presence and influence of lobbying groups. So a lot of these agreements are actually attended, for example, by oil lobbyists, or coal or gas or fossil fuel lobbyists. And it's been suggested that they are increasing funding, political funding and political lobbying means they actually have far more control over these international environmental agreements, and that's leading to a suggestion that there is a conflict of interest between the international environmental agreements and the money and influence that's been injected by interest and lobby groups that represent, for example, the oil and the coal industry. So having a look here at Agenda 21 and this cartoon, you can see that there is very much still, though, this conflict between what environmental scientists say needs to happen and what is actually happening. So here you can, in the cartoon, you can see that we've got the flooding because of global warming, but the real powerhouses are still the banks and industry and the finance sector. So it's suggesting here that Agenda 21 is taking people's freedom away. So again, we've got this concept here. It's suggesting that this whole thing of international agreements in environmentalism is actually a bit like an iceberg. What you see at the top of any organisation is the top of the iceberg. Green everything, marketing, window dressing, sometimes called green washing. So organisations say that they are very, very green, We've already talked about organisations such as BP spending more money on telling the public about the solar cells they've put on their buildings than actually spending on the solar cells themselves. So at that stage you have to question, is this just a PR stunt, or is it actually trying to make a difference? At the end of the day, companies like BP are still petroleum companies, they are still fossil fuel companies. So then we got our iceberg and we think about what is below the iceberg. So actually most of the stuff you can't see, it's below the surface. So it's catastrophic global warming, sea level rise, the environment and economy, all those things are ignored. So there's this idea of a sustainability iceberg. Most of it is actually ignored, and you have that little bit icing on the cake, if you like, of greenwashing. So in this video we've had a think about what exactly are international agreements. We thought about how they have been written so they are actually ineffective. We also thought that looked at how these international agreements are not legally binding in any way, and also the influence of lobbyist groups and actually forming and guiding these environmental agreements. We then went on to think about the political side of things and how still it's very much seen as environmentalism is politically against economic growth. And then we thought about what you're looking at now, the sustainability iceberg. So what you see in sustainability is a tiny, tiny part, possibly the most ineffective part. What you actually don't see are things that are not being done.